Grant interrupted her before she finished her second sentence. He said she was advocating for a vendor with whom she had a personal working relationship, rather than assessing the evidence with the objectivity her position required. A characterization that was both professionally unfair and precisely calculated to make her next sentence harder to say. She stepped back. She did not stop paying attention. Sloane asked Caleb whether he would consider matching the Titan Crest price to remain competitive, and he said no without hesitation or qualification. He explained that reaching that number would require reducing material grade, eliminating at least 2 stages of his testing protocol, or both, and that either modification would introduce a measurable probability of premature component failure. In a system running at Whitmore's throughput, that failure would not announce itself with a warning light or an error code. It would stop the line, and it would stop it at the worst possible time. He was not framing this as a threat. He was describing the physics of the situation, which had the disadvantage of being the same regardless of how the listener chose to receive it. Sloane told him that presenting it as a safety issue sounded like leverage, and Caleb told her she was welcome to characterize it however she found useful, but that the risk would remain the same regardless of what she called his motive. She picked up the termination document and signed it on the corner of his work table. The same surface where, 11 years earlier, he had sketched the first routing diagram for what would eventually become Whitmore's primary production floor, though neither she nor Grant knew that. Grant pressed further, demanding that Caleb surrender all technical specifications currently classified as Whitmore proprietary assets. Caleb noted without raising his voice that the operating blueprints belonged to the company, but that the calibration models, the resonance compensation algorithms, and several of the testing protocols were covered by intellectual property provisions defined in the original North Star Industrial Systems Consulting Agreement, and that those provisions had not been altered by the termination she had just signed. Sloane asked, with genuine incredulity, how a shop of this size had any credible claim to intellectual property relevant to a facility at Whitmore's scale. Caleb looked at her steadily and said she would be surprised by how much of what was inside that factory had begun in this room. He said it the way someone delivers a fact they have known for a long time and have no particular need to dramatize. Before the convoy pulled away, he asked only one thing, that she not introduce the Titan Crest components into an active line without independent load testing first. Grant assured her the components had been properly certified. Caleb examined the certification stamp on the documentation and recognized, with the practiced eye of someone who had authored many such reports himself, that the underlying data values had been reproduced from his own historical records, which meant they had never described Titan Crest's components at all. The activation ceremony for Whitmore's expanded production line took place on a Thursday afternoon in front of an audience that included regional investors, 2 state officials, a delegation from the company's largest client, and enough journalists to ensure that whatever happened next would be thoroughly documented. Grant Halbrook stood at the front of the room and explained how the company's decision to modernize its supply chain had positioned Whitmore Dynamics at the forefront of American industrial manufacturing, a decision that had also, he noted with the measured precision of a man reading from a rehearsed script, reduced component costs by a figure that sounded impressive and had been designed to. No one in the room understood that the figure had been achieved by purchasing untested parts from a company with a financial connection to the man delivering the speech. The Titan Crest components had been installed in the 7 primary robotic stations by a maintenance crew working through the previous night. Leighton Pierce had submitted a written objection before midnight, documenting her concerns about resonance compatibility and requesting that activation be delayed pending a minimum 48-hour load test at controlled throughput. Her objection had been received, logged, and overridden by Grant before 7 in the morning, with a note attached to the record indicating that the chief engineer's concerns had been reviewed and deemed non-critical by operations leadership. For the first 90 minutes, everything performed as announced. The robotic arms moved through their programmed arcs with the fluid precision that had made Whitmore's process a case study in automation efficiency. The conveyor systems accelerated through their operational bands without hesitation. The production monitoring screens displayed output numbers that drew a spontaneous round of applause from the investor gallery, and Sloan stood at the observation window and felt, for a brief window, entirely and correctly vindicated. The feeling was accurate enough to be dangerous. The sensors at Station 7 noticed something before any human in the building did: a deviation in the rotational signature of the coupling joint, small enough to fall within the initial tolerance band, but recurring with a consistency that the system's monitoring software had been designed to treat as significant. The deviation grew by a fraction of a percent with each successive cycle, which meant it was not random noise but a developing condition. Something that was getting worse rather than stabilizing, something that had a direction. The system recorded it, flagged it, and waited for an operator acknowledgement that did not come. Leighton saw the flag within minutes and walked directly to the control station. She requested a line speed reduction to allow for diagnostic measurement. Grant appeared beside her within 40 seconds and stated that the reduction would not occur during a live demonstration with guests present. She told him the flag was not a suggestion. He told her he understood that. She asked him to put his instruction in writing. He did not. When the line reached maximum throughput, the operating ceiling that had been the target of every planning document for 8 months, the number that represented the commercial justification for the entire expansion, the safety system made the decision it had been built to make. Every zone of the facility entered emergency standby in a sequence that took 11 seconds from the first shutdown command to the last. The robotic arms stopped mid-cycle. The conveyors locked. The production screens went dark in a way that had nothing to do with a power failure and everything to do with a set of logical conditions that had been coded into the system's architecture long before the current management team had arrived. Grant said it was a software anomaly. Leighton pulled up the diagnostic log, read the shutdown trigger aloud to the room, and opened the system architecture file. At the bottom of the document, in the author field that no one had examined in years, was a name. Sloan stood in the control room and processed the information at the pace of someone whose understanding of events was being reorganized around a fact she had not previously possessed. She asked Grant to explain how a man operating a shop the size of a residential garage could have been the lead architect of a $600 million industrial facility. Grant's response was immediate, carefully worded, and structured to give the impression of honesty while delivering something substantially different. He said Caleb had been a technical contributor to the North Star Consulting engagement, one of many engineers who had worked on various phases of the project, and that describing him as a lead architect represented exactly the kind of revisionism that happens when someone in a diminished position wants to make their historical role sound larger than the record supports. Leighton did not wait for him to finish. She had already opened the project archive, a repository that predated the factory's foundation pour and had been maintained continuously since, and she moved through it with the controlled efficiency of someone who has suspected something for a long time and is now methodically confirming it. Caleb's digital signature appeared on the production flow schematics, the load balancing algorithms, the thermal management system that regulated joint temperatures under sustained operating loads, and every version of the emergency shutdown protocol that had just, without error, done exactly what it had been designed to do. A set of internal notes documented that during the second phase of installation, Caleb had identified a critical instability in the original design, a flaw in the harmonic balancing of the conveyor system that would have caused structural fatigue within 3 years of full operation, and had redesigned the affected subsystem entirely, not absorbing the additional work without requesting a contract amendment because he considered it part of the obligation he had accepted when he agreed to put his name on the project. Miles confirmed what the documents suggested. He told Sloan that Caleb had lived on site for close to 2 years, working alongside the installation crews, sleeping in the construction trailer, and correcting problems in real time rather than from a desk in a consulting firm's office. The company's founder had offered Caleb a vice president position when the facility opened. He had declined it and gone home to take care of his daughter after losing his wife, and no one in the current leadership structure had known that detail or apparently thought to ask. Sloan asked why Caleb hadn't simply told her this when she came to his shop. The room developed the particular quiet of people who consider the answer self-evident. Leighton provided it without editorializing. He had tried to. He had asked a direct question about the factory's design authorship. He had mentioned the consulting firm. He had set a drawing on the table. She had signed the termination document before any of those gestures could become a conversation. The pressure of the clock clarified things efficiently. Without line restoration within 18 hours, Whitmore would miss a delivery commitment to its largest single client, triggering penalty provisions in an amount that would take the savings from the Titan Crest switch and multiply them by a factor that no one wanted to calculate aloud. The engineering team had spent the past hour attempting standard recovery procedures, and the system had refused each attempt. Not because it was malfunctioning, but because its shutdown logic required the source of the resonance event to be identified and resolved before any restart command would be accepted. This was not a defect. It was the system doing what Caleb had told it to do, which meant the only way through the problem was to engage the person who had given the instruction. Leighton said it plainly. The only person who fully understood the resonance model was the person who had written it. Sloan absorbed that, looked at Grant, and noticed him giving a quiet instruction to a junior analyst that was clearly not meant to reach her. She filed the observation without reacting to it and turned toward the parking lot. The vehicles arrived at Rowan Precision Works for the second time that day after dark, without the earlier performance of corporate confidence. Sloan stepped out alone. She found Caleb at his bench, not waiting for her and not performing indifference, but actually working, examining a component that Miles had quietly retrieved from the factory floor before the lockdown, one of the Titan Crest coupling joints removed from Station 7 during the preliminary diagnostic sequence. He had completed the analysis before she arrived because that was the kind of person he was and the kind of night he had anticipated. The steel Titan Crest had met the dimensional requirements and passed basic hardness testing, which explained why the certification documentation had not appeared fraudulent to anyone conducting a surface review. What the material lacked was the specific vibration damping capacity that the Whitmore system required at peak throughput, a property that did not appear in most standard material specifications because most assembly lines never operated at the frequencies Caleb had designed into this one. At speed, the slight deficiency in damping performance compounded across stations, building exactly the resonance condition that the shutdown sensors had been placed to detect. The system had performed correctly. The components had not. Sloan told him she needed him at the factory that night. Caleb said that the contract between them had been terminated that afternoon, by her in his own shop, on his own table. He stated it without anger and without satisfaction, presenting it as a factual boundary rather than a point of grievance. She offered 5 times his standard consulting rate. He told her the issue had never been the rate, and that paying 5 times an amount she had publicly dismissed as excessive did not resolve the question of whether she understood what she had dismissed or why the dismissal had been wrong. He placed 3 conditions on the table before she could construct an argument. The first was that Leighton Pierce be given full technical authority over the restoration process, with no override permissions available to anyone who lacked a formal engineering credential countersigned by both of them. The second was that no part of the system be pressured into operation while any safety flag remained active in the monitoring log. The third was that an independent audit be opened immediately into the Titan Crest procurement process, covering Grant Halbrook's involvement from the earliest stage of the vendor evaluation. Sloan said the conditions sounded like a man using a crisis to reposition himself in the company's power structure. Caleb picked up a printed email thread and handed it to her in silence. The most recent message in the thread had been sent 3 weeks earlier to Grant Halbrook's corporate address. In it, Caleb had described precisely the resonance risk that had just shut down the factory, the mechanism, the affected stations, the operating threshold at which the problem would emerge, and the specific material property in the Titan Crest components that would generate it. Grant had marked the email as reviewed and attached a note to the record stating that the concerns had originated from a vendor with a financial interest in the outcome and were not considered technically credible. Caleb told her he had not needed the factory to fail in order to demonstrate that he had been right. He had spent 2 years of his life making sure it would not fail, and that commitment had nothing to do with his contract and everything to do with what it meant to put his name on something. Sloan understood for the first time the distance between what she had said in his shop that afternoon and what it had actually cost him to hear it. She apologized. He recognized the apology as genuine and also as the apology of someone in a crisis, real but incomplete. He accepted it anyway, because thousands of people worked in that factory, and none of them were responsible for what had happened in his parking lot. He told her he would come, and she understood from the way he said it that he was not coming for her. Caleb arrived at the Whitmore facility in his own truck, wearing the same canvas work jacket he had worn on the original construction site more than a decade earlier, carrying a tool case whose latches had developed individual sounds from years of use. Several of the senior managers who had laughed at the appropriate moments during the afternoon's inspection were still in the building. They went very still when they saw Leighton meet him at the entrance and walk beside him with the body language of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, with more patience than the situation deserved. He did not go to the control room. He went to the production floor, and he moved through it the way a person moves through a building they designed, not searching for things but verifying them, checking that the world had been built in accordance with the intentions behind it. He crouched beside one of the dormant robot stations and listened to the particular silence with the focused attention of someone who knows what the sound of the absence means. He ran a hand along a structural channel and read the residual vibration pattern through his palm. He walked the full perimeter of Station 7, with his eyes moving across the floor joints, the fastener patterns, the subtle compression signatures in the mounting infrastructure that told a specific story to someone who understood what they were for. He stopped in front of a maintenance access panel that most of the people in the building had never noticed. It was recessed behind Station 7's primary mounting frame, labeled in the typeface of the original construction documentation, accessible by 4 bolts sized to a tool not found in a standard factory kit. Caleb produced the tool from his case without searching for it. The panel opened onto a narrow service corridor running behind the resonance dampening assembly, a passage he had added to the blueprints during the 3rd design revision, after recognizing that any engineer who needed to service the balancing system in the future would otherwise have to dismantle a significant section of the station to reach it. He had built the door before anyone knew they would need it. Inside the corridor, the team confirmed not only the source of the resonance cascade, but evidence that Titan Crest's cost reduction had extended beyond material substitution. The internal geometry of the coupling joint had been altered at the manufacturing stage, a modification that reduced the alloy required per unit by a meaningful amount and was invisible from the outside, but which changed the harmonic behavior of the part under load in ways Caleb recognized immediately from the vibration data the sensors had captured. It was not a manufacturing defect in the conventional sense. It was a design change made without disclosure, at the point of fabrication, to cut the cost of production in a way that the certification documentation would never reveal. Grant arrived on the floor and announced that the situation called for a temporary restart to meet contractual delivery obligations, after which root causes could be investigated fully and transparently. Caleb turned to face him with the unhurried attention of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to perform. He explained that a temporary restart under the present conditions would propagate the resonance pattern through the load-bearing infrastructure of at least 4 adjacent stations, with a probability of cascading damage to robotic actuators whose replacement value he could provide if Grant wanted the figure. Grant told him he was a machinist attempting to direct corporate executives. Caleb directed the room's attention to the technical documentation displayed on the facility's main screen, the system architecture file with the design authorship header at the top, and said Grant was standing inside a system built from the decisions of this machinist, and invited correction if that statement contained an error. Sloan told Grant to step back from the technical discussion. Grant stepped back. The restoration proceeded through the night with a quality that anyone paying attention would have recognized as a demonstration. Not performed for an audience, but simply visible to anyone in the room who was watching. Caleb organized the technical team into 4 working groups, each responsible for a defined zone of the production floor, sequenced in a specific order that accounted for load transfer dynamics as each station was cleared and recertified before the next was approached. The interdependencies were not obvious to anyone who hadn't studied the original design, and Caleb briefed each group without condescension, treating the factory's own engineers as capable people who had been given insufficient information rather than insufficient ability. Rowan Precision Works opened at midnight. 3 machinists who had worked for Caleb for more than a decade ran the equipment through the early hours, producing the remaining coupling joints to the exact specification and testing protocol the Whitmore system required. There was no performance in it, no urgency performed for the observers who moved through the building that night. There was work, and it was done accurately, and the parts arrived on the factory floor before 4 in the morning, still warm from the final inspection stage. They were small enough to hold in one hand and had been built by people who understood what they were for. Layton's team, working in parallel, had moved from the physical failure into its documentation trail. The Titan Crest certification records had been assembled using test data that did not originate from Titan Crest's own quality control process. Serial numbers on validation reports corresponded to batch identifiers from Caleb's production records. Identifiers belonging to shipments that Rowan Precision Works had delivered to Whitmore over the preceding 3 years. Someone had extracted the test results from components that had been properly validated and attached them to components that had never been tested, producing paperwork that would survive a surface audit because the underlying numbers were real. The numbers just didn't describe the parts they claimed to describe. The financial arrangement behind it assembled itself in pieces across the night. Grant held a consulting arrangement with a holding company whose beneficial ownership included a relative by marriage. The holding company maintained a commercial relationship with Titan Crest Supply. The arrangement produced consistent income tied to the volume of business Titan Crest received from Whitmore, which meant that Grant's financial interest in removing Rowan Precision Works was not incidental to the vendor switch. It was the reason for it. Caleb had been identified, in the internal communications now being reviewed, as the primary obstacle to the scheme, not because he was uncooperative, but because he was the one person in proximity to the factory with enough knowledge of the original specifications to recognize when validation data was wrong. Sloan sat with that understanding in the hours before sunrise and followed it to its full conclusion. She had not simply made a poor procurement decision. She had been guided into it by someone who needed her contempt as a mechanism, who had read her tendency to judge by appearance and place the right opportunity in front of it at the right moment, and she had provided the contempt freely, confidently, and publicly, in the man's own workspace, on his own table, in front of his staff. Grant had not manufactured her attitude. He had simply known where to point it. Caleb completed the final component exchange before 6 and began the low-speed verification sequence, running each station at reduced capacity, logging vibration signatures, comparing them against baseline values he carried in memory as much as in documentation, making small calibrations by hand where the measurements required it. When the last station cleared its diagnostic threshold, he stood at the central control panel, studied the status board for a long moment with the particular stillness of a person making sure before they commit, and initiated the restart command. The factory came back online zone by zone, each section returning a green confirmation before the next was permitted to follow. It took 9 minutes. When the last screen cleared, the hum that returned to the building was the same hum that had been there before Grant Halbrook decided a 40% cost reduction was worth what it actually cost. Caleb told Sloan that restoring the machines was the straightforward part. Restoring the confidence of people who had been dismissed by their own leadership was the harder work, and it was not something that happened on a single night. The board convened at 8 that morning in a room that had the atmosphere of a place where consequential things are said and the people present have agreed in advance to sit still for them. Grant had prepared a presentation arguing that the shutdown was attributable to a design vulnerability in the original system architecture, specifically an over-reliance on proprietary components that had created a single-source dependency for which the responsible party was the engineer who had built that dependency into the system and then conveniently positioned himself as the only available remedy. Caleb placed a complete set of design documentation on the table before Grant reached his third slide. The documentation showed that the system had been built with open specifications, tolerances, material grades, testing protocols, and performance criteria defined with enough precision that any qualified supplier could produce conforming components. Rowan Precision Works had held the contract not because the system required it, but because it was the supplier that had met the specification consistently across 8 years. TitanCrest had not failed because the system was exclusive. It had failed because TitanCrest had not actually attempted to meet the specifications, and the person responsible for selecting TitanCrest had known that and proceeded anyway. Evelyn Bancroft was 68 years old and had been on the Whitmore board since before the current CEO's professional career had begun. She arrived with a briefcase that she set on the table without opening for the first 20 minutes, and she listened to Grant's presentation with the expression of a person comparing what is being said against what they already know. When he finished, she opened the case and placed a folder in the center of the table. It contained documentation from the original factory project. The full record of North Star Industrial Systems' engagement with Whitmore Dynamics, including performance evaluations, technical correspondence, and a handwritten assessment from the company's founder. The assessment was 4 paragraphs long. It described the project at the point when Caleb had joined it, over budget, behind schedule, carrying a structural instability that the original engineering team had not identified. It described what he had done, the full subsystem redesign, the material reclassification, the testing protocol he had imposed on himself without being asked, the months he had spent on site after his contractual obligations had technically concluded. And it ended with a sentence that Evelyn read aloud, slowly, making eye contact with Sloan on the final word. The founder had written that if the factory had a true architect, that person was Caleb Rowan, and that whatever the company had paid him, it had not been enough. Sloan heard her own earlier words, the ones about the garage, the wind, the first impression, played back against a documentation record 11 years deep and unambiguous. Grant's employment was terminated before the meeting concluded, his credentials suspended, and the TitanCrest financial records transferred to the relevant oversight authorities. TitanCrest Supply became the subject of formal proceedings related to its fraudulent certification documents. Sloan remained at the table after the others left. Evelyn remained with her and said that a leader's quality is not measured by whether they ever make mistakes. Everyone who holds genuine authority will. But by whether, when the protection of their own judgment is no longer available, they choose accountability over explanation. Sloan asked what accountability looked like in practice. Evelyn told her it looked like what she chose to do next. Sloan arranged a full staff assembly not in the executive conference room, but on the production floor itself, at the base of the line that Caleb had restored the night before. The communications team had prepared a statement, measured, carefully worded, designed to acknowledge the event without creating unnecessary legal exposure. She read the first sentence, set it down, and spoke without it. She told the assembled workers, engineers, and supervisors what had happened, not the operational version or the governance version, but the version that was true. She told them she had walked into a man's workplace and looked at his roof and his table and his hands and made a judgment about his value before she had asked him a meaningful question. That the judgment had been wrong, that it had been wrong in ways that had real consequences for real people, and that she was not going to deliver that fact through a prepared statement. She named Caleb Rowan and told them that the factory they worked in had been designed by him, that the system which had protected every one of them from potentially serious equipment failure had been designed by him, and that she had terminated his contract on the same surface he had once used to sketch the foundations of their workplace. She did not use the word embarrassing, because embarrassment was about her feelings, and this was not about her feelings. Leighton Pierce received a formal and public acknowledgement from Sloan that day. Recognition of the objections she had raised, the written record she had maintained through the process, and the professional risk she had accepted by refusing to stop raising concerns even after being told that her concerns were not credible. Miles Beckett was asked to lead the redesign of the company's component validation process, on the grounds that Miles had understood the value of what Rowan Precision Works provided during a period when the people above him had not. When Sloan offered to acquire Rowan Precision Works outright, at a number that attempted to reflect what the shop's contribution was actually worth, Caleb thanked her without hesitation and declined. He told her that a shop absorbed into a larger organization was no longer a shop. It was a department, and departments operated under pressures that were different from the pressures that had produced the work she was now attempting to purchase. He proposed a formal partnership instead, a long-term development and validation agreement that kept Rowan Precision Works independent, added a technology transfer component so that Whitmore's own engineers could learn the testing methodology, and granted Caleb standing authority to halt any production line change that carried an unresolved safety flag, regardless of the financial implications of the halt. Sloan signed the agreement without requesting modifications, and she added a clause that Caleb had not proposed, one requiring any vendor certification used in a critical system to be independently validated before implementation, with Leighton Pierce as the mandatory final technical signatory. Caleb accepted the additional clause and told Sloan that trust was not established by a signature, but by what followed after the papers were filed. She said she understood that. He believed her. Not because he had certainty about it, but because the way she said it suggested she had stopped performing certainty she didn't have, which was its own kind of beginning. 6 months after the events of that Thursday, Rowan Precision Works looked exactly the same from the road. The sign above the door was still faded to the point where the lettering required some goodwill to decipher. The lot still held only a few vehicles. The table inside still bore the evidence of many years of work in the marks and discolorations of its surface. Young engineers from Whitmore's technical staff came through several times each week now, learning how the testing protocols functioned, how to read the data that emerged from them, and why the numbers that looked small on paper, the fractions of millimeters, the micro variations in vibration frequency, were the numbers that kept very large machines from failing very publicly. Some of them arrived expecting a classroom. They found a working shop, and they learned by watching a person who had always considered the doing and the teaching to be the same activity. Sloan Whitmore had not been transformed into a different kind of person by a single crisis. She was still precise, still demanding, still inclined to think in terms of scale and measurable outcome. But she had begun doing something she had not done before the events of that week. She went to the floor on ordinary days, without announcement, to speak with the workers and engineers who understood the factory from the inside rather than from the summary document. She had installed a requirement that every operational recommendation reaching her desk carry a technical sign-off from the relevant floor engineer, not as a formality, but as a condition of consideration, and she had stopped interpreting that requirement as a slowdown and started interpreting it as information. Leighton Pierce had been appointed to a newly created role that gave her the authority her expertise had always warranted. Miles Beckett ran the new component safety program with the bluntness and rigor of a person who had seen what happened when those qualities were absent, and the program was respected accordingly. The factory ran through the following 2 quarters without a single unscheduled line interruption, a record that drew attention in the industry and that the communications team was eager to publicize. Sloan let them, but she had stopped measuring the factory's performance by its public reception. During a tour arranged for a group of prospective investors, one of the visitors looked at the production floor behind them and asked who had designed the system that made the operation function with such consistency. The room behind them was one of the most sophisticated automated facilities in the country, and the question had several possible true answers. The consulting firm, the construction team, the many engineers who had contributed across the project's phases. Sloan gave none of those answers. She looked past the visitor, through the facility's western windows, toward the small building with the faded sign that sat 3 miles down the main road. She said the person who designed it was working right now, and she pointed in the direction of a roof that had never needed to advertise itself because the work it sheltered had always spoken before anyone thought to ask. Inside that building, Caleb stood at his bench, checking a component that most people would never see and had no reason to think about. Small enough to hold in one hand, precise enough to keep a $600 million line running without a tremor, made by the same person who had built that line long before the people now admiring it had arrived to stand in front of it. He set the piece down, checked the calibration reading, and reached for the next one. Working in the same place Sloan Whitmore had once laughed at, before she learned that the things worth building rarely announce themselves the way people who haven't built anything tend to expect.